scholarship, that a scholar that I enjoy reading. I don't agree with him on a lot of stuff, but it's Dominic Crossan, and the challenge of Jesus. The participants page, you can get it PDF, and it's just a helpful booklet. And but Dominic Crossan is a world authority on historical Jesus studies, and his booklet "Faith and Reason: The Challenge of Jesus," John Dominic Crossan. And anyhow, in the first session, "The World of Jesus: Peace Through Victory," he asks some questions. In summary, in the first session of "The World of Jesus: Peace Through Victory," John Dominic Crossan offers the following: before Jesus of Nazareth existed, even if Jesus had never existed, there already was in the first century Mediterranean world a human being who was called Divine, Son of God, God incarnate, God from God, Lord Redeemer, Liberator, Saviour of the world. Those were the titles of Caesar Augustus before Jesus ever existed. The titles are written in stone scattered on the ground throughout the Mediterranean world. The titles of the Roman Emperor in the palace of the Palatine Hill in Rome were taken from him and given to a Jewish peasant on the Nazareth ridge in Galilee of pale places. Was this some kind of a joke? Octavius, soon to be Augustus, defeats Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium on the 2nd of September 31st BC. That evening, following the battle, while on board his boat, Octavius has a dream, and the god Apollo, who is reputed to be the divine father of Octavian, appears above his ship and says to him, "Saviour of the world, now conquer at sea, the land is already yours." That title is quite clear. Octavius Augustus to be has saved the Roman world from an absolutely self-destructive civil war. Julius Caesar also appears to him and says, "You are of my blood. This victory proves it." We are beginning to see an emphasis on victory. It all depends on victory. Everything would be totally different if that battle were even a draw. In this session, we begin to see clearly and succinctly the Roman mantra of religion, war, victory, peace. That was the Roman program and the program of every empire that has ever existed in the history of the world. Peace through victory. Dr. Crossan points out that Rome, by the way, never claimed to have invented that program of peace through victory. They only claim to have perfected it, to have received it at the will of gods, and to have universalized it to the world. Rome would have said that peace through victory was the way of the world, of civilization itself. What other way, would have asked rhetorically, could you ever get world peace except through world victory? So I think that what Dominic Crossan is trying to do here, and I don't agree with him, but I do agree with him. I don't agree with him in the sense that he's taking Roman words, i.e., Son of God, Divine, Incarnate, God from God, Lord Redeemer. He's taking these words from the Roman political and religious ideology, and then he's implying that the Jews took these titles and put it on Jesus. And I think the problem with that is that Christianity is completely rooted primarily in its theology in Judaism. I said primarily because, for example, in the Gospel of John, you have the word logos, which is used by Jewish philosopher Philo, but also used by secular philosophers as well. But generally speaking, the Christian faith is rooted in Judaism. So the titles that Christianity is using are from Judaism, principally. That's what I would say. However, I do think it's important to look at the political context, and I do think that the political context is overplayed by Dominic Crossan, but I think that there is something to be said to look into the political background of the first century. So So that's the booklet, The Challenge of Jesus, that you can go and read by John Dominic Crossan. It's PDF. So we're going to look at a guy called Dale Allison now. And we're going to look at a paper by Dale Allison called The Secularizing of the Historical Jesus by Dale C. Allison, Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, Pittsburgh, PA. So this is the kind of scholars that I read and that I study. And we're going to look at a paper of his called The Secularizing of the Historical Jesus. You can get it down on PDF. Now, I have to say that I'm an evangelical. I don't agree with Dominic Crossan's scholarship, generally speaking, just to put that in. And I don't agree with Dale C. Allison's scholarship, generally speaking. They don't believe in the Bible as the Word of God. They don't believe the theology that I believe. But I do believe it's important to read other scholars and to look at other scholars and to critique them and to learn from them. So we're going to read passages of Dale Allison's article, and then we're going to just reflect some thoughts concerning what he said. Okay. And the invitation's gone out if people want to come in and join in the conversation. But it has to be an honest conversation. If you're not interested, please don't bother coming into the Google Hangout. Principally those who are just here to cause trouble, I would ask that you politely just stay away. Thank you. Anyhow, Dale Allison says, the modern world has, according to current wisdom, witnessed three quests for the historical Jesus. The first was the 19th century German endeavor so ingeniously and memorably reported by Albert Schweitzer. The second was the new quest inaugurated by Ernest Kaisman, famous 1950 lecture in Marburg, and then carried on by some of Rudolf Bultmann's students and a few others. The so-called third quest, christened such by N.T. Wright, is the name now often attached to the labels of the present moment. It is unfortunate that this neat triadic division of our subject has now established itself in our servers and textbooks. For in its simplicity, it is simplistic. It obscures much more than it illuminates. One fundamental failing is that it dismisses with silence the period between the first quest and the new quest. The inescapable implication is that nothing much and nothing much of importance was then going on. One chronicler of Jesus' research has affirmed that the internal in question can indeed be called the period of no quest. The interval in question can indeed be called the period of 1906 and 1953. A newfound awareness that Christians typically look down the well of history only to see their own reflected faces, combined with skepticism about Marx's historicity, the acid of form criticism and new theology that isolated faith from history, created a period where the general optimism of discovering a relevant historical Jesus behind the portraits of the Gospels, an optimism which viewed the old quest, was lost. In line with N.T. Wright says that during the first half of our century there was a moratorium upon questing for Jesus. This is just not true. Anyone can properly assess this claim by walking into a decent theological library and looking at the shelves. If the expectation is that after Schweitzer and before Kaisman, New Testament scholars gave up questing for Jesus, one will be dumbfounded. As a sample of what might find in such library, I subjoin at the end of this essay a list of some are the relevant books that appeared between 1906 and 1953, with the understandable exception of a couple of years during World War I, 1914-1915, only 1 year, 1919, did not, according to my cursory research, witness a new book on Jesus by an academic. Moreover, very few of the names on my list will be unfamiliar to anyone who has done serious work on the New Testament, so it was scarcely only marginal scholars who were engaged in the quest for Jesus. We are not talking about second stringers on the sidelines of New Testament studies. It was, on the contrary, not only a rather large, but more importantly, fairly august body of scholars that was unaware of the supposed moratorium upon questing for Jesus. The inevitable interim between inference to be drawn from my list of titles that questing for Jesus was alive and well the second half of is more confirmed by the hundreds upon hundreds of articles then written on historical Jesus, as well as by the surveys of research that came from that time. In 1925, Shirley Jackson Case's remarked that writers upon the life of Jesus who have taken up seriously the task of carrying forward the work of historical criticism in its application to the study of the life of Jesus have performed some significant tasks during the past quarter century. A decade after E.F. Scott could write that nothing is more remarkable in the literature of our time than the endless procession of lives of Jesus. And he was not just offering a generalization about popular books all the time. It is our critical picture of Jesus is taking more definite shape. Each of these writers, J. Clauser, J. Washer, S.E. Case, R. Bultmann, W.B. Bacon, and the list may be greatly extended, has brought at least one aspect of the history into fuller relief. All the discussion is clearly the way towards something like a true judgment. Brown spoke in 1940 of evidence of progress in connection with the study of historical Jesus in the period since Weiser, and he was optimistic about its continuation. Quote, the new critical techniques and the new philosophical points of view which now prevail provides new means of solving the old problems in their new forms. Progress is possible. End of quote. 2 years later, D.T. Rawlinson wrote about the continuing quest of the historical Jesus and how it's been carried forward in recent years. And in 1950, A.M. Hunter published The Work and Words of Jesus, a popular digest of the allegedly non-existent quest. End of quote. Just having a break here just for a minute, and we'll come back. In view of the manifest facts, what has nurtured our ignorance of the past and led to the false generalizations who often now met, that the period after Bultmann gave up the quest, beyond the unfortunate fact that too many now neglected to read old books because they evidently imagined that the new books have rendered them obsolete, two factors especially suggest themselves. One is that largely because of source criticism and to a lesser extent because of form criticism, even conservative evangelical English scholarship came to the conclusion that a biography of Jesus cannot be provided. Thus, A.M. Hunter, at mid-century, thought that one of the chief features of books on Jesus over the period of 50 years was that they had largely ceased to aspire to be biographies in any traditional sense. Perhaps some have misunderstood the circumstances that they had given up writing about his life and teaching, but the two are hardly the same. The dearth of traditional lives, the abandoning of the Markan framework, and the refusal to map the development of Jesus' self-consciousness cannot be equated with the dearth of studies on the historical Jesus. So the first half of our century was not the period of no quest, but of no biography. Another factor, and probably the more weighty one, is that so many now, regardless of their own theological stance, see the past through Bultmann's eyes. This is a mistake, although it is understandable. Rudolf Bultmann must be reckoned the foremost New Testament scholar of his century, and no time, however, were he and his students the only players in the theological game. Even in Germany, and it took several decades before the full impact of the skeptical form critical investigation began to be widely felt abroad. Before the 1950s, many serious researchers in the English-speaking world still regarded form criticism as a tempest in a teapot. Beyond that, it was only in the late 1950s that to make numerous converts outside his own country. Hugh Anderson could still write in 1964 that the big guns of the new theological movement of the continent certainly caused no immediate tottering at the foundations of British historical critical scholarship. It would be safe to say that there has been hardly less disgust among British it would be safe to say that there has been hardly less distrust among British than among American scholars in these last 40 years towards the crisis theology, or the theology of the word. Just to interject here, I think Dale Allison is a pretty brilliant scholar, and I think that his research is impeccable, but I think that he's cutting it fine in what he's saying at the moment. If you it's all right him quoting all these articles in the midst of the various quests, saying that the simplistic understanding of these quests, you know, the historiography about the historical Jesus, the idea that there were these three quests, which he critiques N.T. Wright for stating that. I think he's correct that there can be a simplistic understanding of history in terms of, you know, we demarcate historical time frames, and sometimes that can be simplistic. So he's correct in that, but at the same time, I think he's splitting hairs. I think if you, if you immerse yourself in the theological atmosphere of the 1950s, the 1960s, if you immerse yourself in the academic atmosphere from 1900 to the 1960s, you'll tend to find that N.T. Wright's comment is correct, and that Dale Allison is pushing it a bit. You know, by the time you get to Bultmann, there was a stranglehold on the idea of who Jesus was, that we couldn't know much about him. That stranglehold was there. And okay, it might not be a quest for a biography, and there might be an indication that we could know something of Jesus, but the culture of that time, it was monolithic. It was monolithic. Bultmann's school ruled the roost. In British academic scholarship, there was always a fine tradition, going back to Lightfoot, Westcott and Hort. Those who were AV people might not agree with Westcott and Hort. I'm not saying I agree with them, but there was a fine tradition with Lightfoot and I think the Cambridge academics, Bishop of Durham, one of the bishops from Durham at the turn of the century. There was always a fine British scholarship that was always independent and a bit more rigorous and conservative in its reflection. But still, the Bultmann school was monolithic in its stranglehold on scholarship in the 1950s and 60s, which would strongly challenge Dale Allison there. Anyway, in 1959, if you want to know more about that, if you type in Rudolf Bultmann, you'll be able to get some talks that I did on Rudolf Bultmann. In 1959, W. Day Davis entitled his inaugural lecture, Union Theological Seminary in New York, A Quest to be Resumed in New Testament Studies. The subject was the historical Jesus. By the time a significant number of Anglo-American scholars indeed began to notice that the quest had been or was being given up in certain important quarters, skepticism was settling in everywhere. But timidity in reconstructing the life and teaching of Jesus was recent development. As Professor Davis was told me, no one in Britain or America would have delivered a lecture with his title like this, which implied that the quest had been interrupted. In 1920 and 1930s and 1940s, even in 1950s, only later did the sort of confidence in the Jesus tradition that one finds in T.W. Manson and Vincent Taylor begin to look uncritical to just about everybody. Only in the 1950s did English-speaking scholars come to appreciate fully that the gospel reflects above all the manifest interest of early Christians, and that those interests were far removed from those of modern historians. Concurrent with the realization and spurred on by the growing influence of Paul Tillich and translations of the writings of Bultmann and Karl Barth, just to note that Paul Tillich was no historical Jesus study expert. At the growing influence of Paul Tillich and translation of the writings of Bultmann and Karl Barth, quote, Karl Barth was no historical Jesus fan neither. That's just me. Translations of writings of Bultmann and Karl Barth doubt as to the theological relevance of the historical Jesus began to assail many. So I'm correct. It is no coincidence that Karl Martin Karl's Die Sogenannte Historische Jesus under the Gestaltliche Bildung Christus is German. The original German edition was first published in the 19th century, found no English translator until the 1960s, and yet by the time the influence of the old British anchor-conservatism was waning, the so-called New Quest had already been set in motion, so there was hardly ever a period of no quest. All this was set at one time. All this was at one time not esoteric knowledge. In 1959, so all this was at the time not esoteric knowledge. In 1959, James M. Robinson began his book A New Quest for the Historical Jesus by referring to the obvious, namely, the relatively untroubled and uninterrupted quest of the historical Jesus going on in French and Anglo-Saxon scholarship. As Robinson knew, the quest had been discontinued in Bultmann quarters, but nowhere else, not elsewhere. So the new quest that he hailed was quite self-consciously a specifically post-Bultmann understanding, constructed upon a critical restudy of the Bultmann position by his leading pupils. Some retrospects, however, now often leave the mistaken impression that the evolution of the Bultmann school, which was thoroughly German Protestant phenomenon that interacted hardly at all with Catholic or Protestants who did not write in German, can be equated with the course of New Testament studies after World War One. I think that's a fair point. Such retrospects leading the unwary astray to the defective inference that since the old quest ended with Schweitzer and the new quest started with Kaisman, between no one could have been searching for the historical Jesus. Perhaps the current typology appeals to some because despite the pause, Schweitzer and labours outside of Bultmann's circle, nothing of lasting value or interest was, so they condescendingly produced. Robinson, for one, eschewed the relatively untroubled and uninterrupted quest of the historical Jesus in France and the English-speaking world, as well as the products of the old-style German questers such as Johann Jeremias and Ethelbert Stuffer. Joachim Jeremias wrote an important work on the parables. That's just my own comment there. For Robinson, the important studies had not and were not going to come from anywhere but dialogue with Bultmann. A similar sort of judgment is even of unintended, seemingly implicit in the current typology of the quest, according to which there was, despite the plethora of literature, no real quest for 50 years. But maybe Robinson was wrong and had things backwards, and I at last am tempted to think of the current typology as an expression of ingratitude. For if anything failed, it was the so-called new quest. Despite being the middle member of the current typology, its productivity, comparatively speaking, was short-lived and hardly far-reaching. The non-Bultmannian circles, by contrast, are produced before Kaisman, often cited lecture, at least 4 critical works of enduring value. Dodd's The Parables of the Kingdom, T.W. Manson's The Sayings of Jesus. Manson's book still is consulted regularly for his commentary value, a truly rare feat for a volume 50 years ago, and if I may be personal, my own recent theory of evolution of Q, for which it may be worth, grew out of Manson's insight that Q falls into discrete major sections. As for the contribution of Jeremias and Dodd on the parables, they remained as important as anything else on the same subject that has since come along. Norman Perrin had it right when he observed of Jeremias the parable of Jesus that today it is the essential starting point of parable research. It represents a watershed in the development of the discussion, taking upon itself the work of the two most important previous scholars, Adolf Judger and C.H. Dodd. This sentence, written in 1975, has now been undone by a quarter century of further study. One can equally say that Jeremiah's work on the Last Supper took up into itself the important studies that came before it, and has become foundational for all subsequent studies of its subject. There is more to my argument. I should like to emphasize that just getting our own history down right and recognizing out of courtesy and for the sake of humility our debt to predecessors, those who do not know the exegetical past condemn themselves to repeat it, to recapitulate in older debates unknowingly. Just a point. I think he's made a good point mentioning Jeremiah's and C.H. Dodd, which should be remembered in the quest. Anyhow, he goes on, many now suffer from exegetical amnesia so that they stake out old claims as though they were new. Moreover, if we can cast aside the strange notions that New Testament scholarship must, like the hard sciences, ever progress onward and upward, then there is no reason to doubt that some of the older books about Jesus might get us as close or as closer to the truth than some of the more recent ones. If the typology I am criticizing falsely characterizes the first half of the 20th century and might mislead people into believing that during that time scholars did not produce instructive literature on Jesus, it also distorts the fact from the period between 1950 and 1980, the later being the date one chronicle offers for the approximate birth date of the so-called Third Quest. This is the period in which the new quest of Bultmann students is located, but much else, I would say, much else of more importance must be located here, concurrent with the more or less independent of the much ballyhooed but disappointing new question before 1980 publishers gave us books in the second list subjoined to the end of this article, which, like the first, makes no pretense to being exhaustive. The 1950s and 60s and 70s also saw the publication of the new important New Testament Christologies that had much to say about Jesus, those of Oscar Cullmann, Ferdinand Hand, and R. H. Fuller were perhaps the most prominent, as well as three significant German theologies of the New Testament that open with substantial accounts of historical Jesus, those of Werner Kummel and Leonard Couplet, and Jeremiah's 1971, unfinished. Just to say that I read quite a lot of Cullmann when I was at seminary, and I wasn't really impressed. It's just philosophical theories garnished with a little historical construction. Just put that caveat there. Anyhow, and then there were the articles, says Dale Arison, which at a glance the appropriate volumes of Enculus reveals were not lacking. Gustav Allen, writing in 1973, observed the literature on Jesus is now experiencing prosperity that was over 25 years ago, before many now tell us the opposed third quest started. Allen was correct, so one wonders what is truly different about the recent contributions, and why so much of the literature I have cited should be excluded from our typology and so shoved into oblivion. What sets the so-called third quest apart from the previous? Although several straits have been nominated, none which helps us with this question. The attention to extra-canonical sources, so important for some concurrent questers, is sometimes said to mark the third quest, but many contemporary questers, including E.P. Sanders and John Mayer, stick pretty much to the canonical sources. In any case, the discussion and evaluation of tradition about Jesus in extra-biblical material is scarcely a post-New Quest phenomenon. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi documents, including the Gospel of Thomas, has certainly enlarged our interest in the non-canonical sources for Jesus, but such interest was hardly born around the 1980s. The struggle against apocalyptic eschatology, against the belief that Jesus thought the eschatological consummation to be at hand, a struggle that characterized the work of John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, Burton Mack, might also be thought a singular feature of the current discussion. But this too is nothing new under the sun. Crossan and others have just taken the baton from earlier scholars such as C.H. Dodd, T. Francis Glasson, and John A. T. Robinson. It's not obvious that the former have had more influence in our day than the later had in theirs. Nor can one find anything much original in the way of method. N.T. Wright has indeed urged the contrary, that the third quest sets itself by an emphasis upon Jesus' Jewish context and Jewish character. There is some truth in this, but this emphasis is part and parcel of a much larger tendency, the attempt to interpret all of early Christianity as a Jewish phenomenon. Thus, Paul's Jewish context and character are also highlighted by present scholarship. In addition, the focus upon Jesus the Jew marks not a few new beginning, but only an intensification of a line of investigation that were opened by our predecessors. Rudolf Otto, William Manson, Jeremias were all in their own way trying to find Jesus by looking for Judaism. We may regard their use of Jewish sources as less sophisticated than our own, and we may further, with the guilt of Holocaust hanging over our heads and the modern spirit of relativism, urging us not to reckon one religion better than another, see more continuity with Judaism than they did, and yet we continue to walk in the direction which they, along with so many earlier Jewish scholars wrote about Jesus, were headed. It's interesting, he doesn't note that some of the Jewish scholars in the 1920s and 30s were ignored by the mainstream scholarship because of the Bultmann influence. I just put that in. Berger Pearson has suggested that the alleged third quest is distinguishable from the first two quests in claiming to lack any theological agenda. One concur that E.P. Sanders does not wear his theological convictions, whether they may or may not be, on his sleeve, and that John Mayer has been trying to write about Jesus with minimal interference with his Catholic convictions, but then neither scholar is in this respect typical. Are we to say that Ben F. Mayer and A.E. Harvey and N.T. Wright and anyone else does not write with significant theological interest cannot be third questers? Further, it is evident that some we might think of as having no theological agenda are partly animated by animus against traditional Christian doctrine, which is in reality just another sort of theological agenda. The truth is that none of us is free of philosophical bias or theological interest that we examine the origins of Christianity. So the alleged lack thereof seems a questionable criteria for classifying scholars who quest for Jesus. One is not even sure that the so-called third quest volumes of production, so much remarked upon, means much. There just happens to be more New Testament scholars and publishers of what scholars produced than in the past. This is why books on Paul have also multiplied of late. So too are books on Hebrews and even books on James and Jude. The guild is much larger than in the past, and there are many more publishers and journals than in the past. So there are naturally more books and articles on Jesus than the past. I think that's a bit simplistic. I think it's just because we're knowing more about that time. Maybe the major difference between what is going on now and what went on early is that today, for whatever reason, some of the books about Jesus have garnered unexpected publicity. Maybe the quest has changed less than its marketing. I think that's a little bit too cynical, but there is some truth in that. To what extent is the assertion that we have recently embarked upon a third quest due to the ever-present temptation to flatter ourselves and bestow our own age agrarian significance to imagine the contemporary to be of more important than it is? We often cannot read our place in history very well. We typically enlarge and isolated and so distorted. A friend just sent me an article explaining how science and religion are finally common ground. So that's the article, and we're just going to have a break for a few minutes, and then I'm going to just finish off my thoughts. So coming to the end, we'll pick up on the article. We've left at page 14. And so we'll pick up at page 14 another time. The article is Dale Allison, The Secularizing of the Historical Jesus Day, C. Allison, Jr., Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, Petersburg, PA. That's the article that we've been looking at, and we'll be looking at the second part at another stage. So we've looked at a few thoughts by Dominic Crossan and a few paragraphs by Dale Allison. Now, like I said, I don't agree with these scholars. I'll just put you onto a couple of books that I would recommend that you go and read. So we'll go to some books that are helpful. So I'll just show you some books that recommended reading on the topic. Dominic Crossan's book. Dominic Crossan's book is really good in terms of sociology, and he uses a lot of sociology, archaeology, and he mixes it in his studies of the life of Jesus, and it's a very interesting book. I don't agree with his conclusions, but definitely a good book. E.P. Saunders, The Historical Figure of Jesus. E.P. Saunders is someone you really need to read if you're going to be taken seriously in studying these topics. Principally influenced by looking at the context of Jesus from a Jewish perspective. Wouldn't agree with what I believe, but a very good scholar and very helpful if you're going to start reading on the topic. Just see. So Saunders, like I said, I don't agree with his scholarship generally speaking, but he does give background information about Judaism and how it relates to Jesus and Paul, etc. So he's definitely someone you need to. Giza Vermeers is a Dead Sea Scroll expert. He's dead now, but I think influenced by Catholicism, went back to his Jewish roots. But again, I wouldn't agree with everything that he said, but very important writer in this topic. So I'll give you a couple of books that are more conservative. So here you've got, excuse me. Here you've got his famous 3-volume work on Jesus. Massive work. I don't agree with Tay Wright fully. I think he's gone off the rails when it comes to evangelicalism, but you can't doubt his massive scholarship, and he deserves respect for that. So his works are very helpful, and these are some of the books that you need to be reading if you're gonna. I had to read so quite a lot of we had a full semester on N.T. Wright. You know, we had to read quite a lot of N.T. Wright at seminary. His work, which is important when it comes to Jesus on Paul, is important. Looks at things in a historical context. But definitely a guy you need to read. Just getting there we are. This book is a book that I would endorse as the methodology, the scholarship, everything. I would totally agree with, and you know, I would recommend that you. I would recommend that before you dive into reading all these other books, that this would be the book that you get hold of if you want, if you're an evangelical, because it will kind of encourage your faith. Also, he's two books on miracles, which looks at the supernatural and how it relates to Christianity and stuff. Not really a historical Jesus book, but The Resurrection, a newer historical approach, is a good book to get hold of. Seeing what this is a book that as you know, this is a book that I've raved about for the last couple of years. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, a good book to read. Don't agree with everything that he says, Balcom, but definitely wrote some a standard work that's pretty old but very helpful is this New Testament documents. Not in the by F. Bruce. Very helpful. Blomberg's books very helpful. He's a good scholar, very helpful, and this book helpful. Don't agree with everything, but don't forget I'm a conservative evangelical, so many of these writers wouldn't necessarily agree with in all that they do. But Craig Keener, I would definitely endorse. Seeing what else is there. I enjoyed reading this book a while back. Who Chose the Gospels? Probing the Great Gospel Conspiracy. I really enjoyed that. Very good, well-researched book. You can find videos on that. Heresy and Author: How Contemporary Culture's Fascination with Diversity Has Reshaped Our Understanding of Early Christianity. Just have a look inside this. Howard Marshall. Yeah, an interesting book. I've only read a little bit of that book. I like this guy. I enjoy reading this guy. Good guy. I've done videos on him. Michael J. Kruger. Very helpful. He's done another one here. So those are some books that you could read of his. New Testament critic Metzer's book is very helpful to read. Gordon Fee is a very interesting, helpful scholar to study, especially on exegesis. What else? Jesus. Let's put Jesus. Not a scholarly work, but R.C. Sproul's a good guy. Not a scholarly work, but an interesting work by Philip Yancey. Well worth reading. Yeah, that's stuff on the life of Jesus. I'll show you some books, theology books that I would read. Forgive the spelling. Wayne Grudem's systematic theology is very helpful, very simple, very clear, full of scripture. Not a tremendously massive academic work, but very helpful. Louis Berkhof's works very helpful in terms of philosophy. Calvinistic theologian. Very helpful if you want to understand philosophy and its relationship to theology, because it's sometimes said that his books, Herman Bavinck's book, Done Again in Modern Times. So very. It's a classic work, simple theology book by J.I. Packer, but quite deep, well worth reading. The John Calvin's Christian Institute is probably one of the best theology books ever written. Definitely worth reading. Just love Calvin. Very spiritual, very godly writer. These books are very helpful by Francis Schaeffer, looking at culture and philosophy and art and how it relates to theology. Really, really helpful books to read. Jerry Bridges is a very helpful writer, very practical, down to earth, godly writer. Who else is there? What does the Bible really teach about homosexuality? Kevin D. Young is a good writer and very helpful theologian that's coming up today. John Frame, theologian, very helpful in his writing of theology and its relationship to philosophy, very helpful indeed. So you got quite a few of his books. You get some on his website free. Well, from a Calvinistic perspective, but still very helpful. So there's quite a bit of his writing there. These books are very helpful. Contours of Theology. Edmund P. Clowney is a very good theologian, and there's a few other writers in this series that are very helpful. So I'd have a look at those. There's another one here by Sinclair Ferguson. Very in-depth, solid pieces of work. There was some controversy with Donald MacLeod in his church. I don't know what it was all about, but that book of his there is a pretty brilliant theologian, even though you might not agree with everything. So Contours of Theology is a good series anyway to look into. Joe Bray, Doctrine of God. Anyhow, they're definitely worth looking into. I wouldn't recommend this guy. He's not orthodox or anything like that, but I've always had an interest in Karl Barth, and this guy, Bruce L. McCormack, is a world authority on Karl Barth. I met him once in Edinburgh when he was lecturing, and his book on Karl Barth his main book on the intellectual history of Karl Barth. It was a brilliant book, and thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a great help to me. But it is not as orthodox as you and I would particularly like. Seeing what other books are around. Just get Charles Hodge, my favourite, one of my favourite scholars. Jonathan Edwards' works, American theologian, very helpful. This is a good book on revival, religious affections, yeah, into philosophy. His book on the freedom of the will, it's a classic. Luther, I love Luther. I just think he's great. No, he made some mistakes. It's quite a lot on. Just go back to that. Westminster Confession of Faith is a great confession. I love that confession. Also, the Heidelberg Confession. It's a good confession. This is a good confession to read. You might not agree with everything, but it's only cheap. 1689. Studied that quite a few years ago with the pastor. Good biography by the Banner of Truth. And it's Or Palmer's Rosran. Or Palmer Robertson is a theologian that I like. He's a godly guy. Book on the prophets. Great preacher as well. And then Voss. I love Voss. Great guy, old scholar. Voss again. Love Goss. I can't get enough of Voss. He's a good guy. Voss again. These are scholars I love. This is a great classic work by Herman Ridderbos, a Reformed guy. Very helpful work. And this is a book that, where are you? Where have you gone? Voss again. Voss is a great guy. I love Voss. His Reformed Dogmatics. So she Reformed Dogmatics. As you know, this is a great work. I raved about this thing. Even if you're an Arminian or whatever, it's a great work to read. That Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, 4 volumes. Absolutely wonderful work to read. Absolutely wonderful. If you want to understand my understanding of Israel, and what's God's view about Israel, just for those who think I'm not into Israel, that's not true. If you go to Don Calvin's sermons here on Ephesians are awesome, absolutely awesome, and on Galatians, awesome. There we are, Calvin on the Beatitudes. If you want to understand my understanding concerning Israel, if you type in Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, go and see what he has to say, because that's my position. A.W. Pink, very helpful writer. Oswald Chambers, good night. Best book ever, Studies in the Sermon Out by Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. Great guy, Lloyd-Jones. Great guy. Get Lloyd-Jones. Great guy. Great guy. That's his Roman series. You can actually go and listen to them for free if you type in Lloyd-Jones, so you can get the whole Roman series. Well worth reading. Awesome stuff. This is meat. This is meaty stuff. Problem with the Roman series, though, it was edited by Horton, and it's a bit wooden in the editing, but definitely an awesome series of books there. One of my favorite writers of all time. Jonathan Edwards, a new biography by Ian Murray, is a tremendous work. The Life of Lloyd-Jones paperback would be a good work by. I've read the 2-volume work by Ian Murray. These two, which are my favorite books. And there's the Whitefield. You must read the Whitefield volumes. They're very inspiring. Ian Murray's book there. When Ian Murray wrote this book, I'd actually sent him a paper about the life of Lloyd Jones to him, and if you read his book, it's exactly mirrors my paper. I'm not saying he copied me, but he definitely got the idea from me. John MacArthur's Servant of the Word of the Flock by Ian Murray, excellent book. Get some John MacArthur. John MacArthur is a great guy, and these are some of his books. So. And then finally, Al Muller. This guy is a great guy. I like this guy. Al Muller. Now he's a scholar of a scholar. He is. He's a great scholar. He's got it all. Apologetics, exposition of the word. Al Muller books. Al Muller. Yeah. There we are. R.C. Sproul. What is the Trinity? Prayer. Oh, I don't agree with him on his baptism thing. I don't think. But anyhow, I agree with. I just like the guy. He's just been a great help to me. Holiness of God is his classic work. So there we are. Apologetics. Let's see what. This is a good book for apologetics. Defending your faith. Just some books to recommend about apologetics. Don't agree with everything John says, but his books on apologetics are helpful. That book on atheism is very helpful. Ravi Zacharias is very helpful. Why Suffering? And then there's Who Made God? Okay, so you've had a taste of kind of books that I read, the kind of writers that I look at, and you've had a bit of New Testament scholarship, so you've had it all there. So I tell you what I'll do. I'll go show you some of the resources that I go to. Um, So there's Covenant Seminary. I love Covenant Seminary, their attitude, the way they conduct themselves. But there's so many resources for studying there. So avail yourself of that. Reformed Theological Seminary, loads of free iTunes materials on there. Very helpful. Very, very helpful. So the Baptist Theological Seminary, loads of resources that you can listen to lectures and stuff there. Greg Manson is a guy I like in terms of apologetics, and True Forms has quite a few of his articles on there that you can go and read that I find very helpful for apologetics. Then it's got Van Til stuff there as well. That's very helpful. C.S. Lewis Institute is very helpful. Lots of good scholars are helpful. These are just ministries that I've always gone to over the years. The Brief Fellowship. You can go study there in the summer. Very helpful. I encourage you to do that. Study with scholars. Meet young people. Really, really good. What else is there? Website Dr. Mike Lloyd Jones. Tons of sermons that you can listen to for free there. So you've got like 1,600 sermons there. So you've got all these sermons that you can look to. 232 on Ephesians, 117 on Acts, etc. Yeah. So what else is there? Monergism is a place where you can go and study loads of theology and stuff, tons of stuff. MP3. So you can just study thousands of preachers and lectures on, so very, very good. Next one, sermon index. Sermon index. There's classic sermons and stuff. Great preachers on there. Love this place. So you got Tozer, you got Alan Redpath. Alan Redpath's a great guy. Great preaching there. Okay. So these are just some of the things that I find a blessing and a help. What else is there? Miss you, John MacArthur. I find John a great help, great blessing. You get free stuff there. And tons of stuff, tons and tons and tons of stuff that you can get. Okay, so it gives you some idea of things that I like, and I hope it's been a blessing to you, and see you soon. God bless.